ओके स्टार्ट करते हैं इनिट स्टेट समझाने से. ठीक है. So in the init state, I actually called this connectivity checker to check whether we are connected to Wi-Fi or mobile. If yes, then we are actually going to fetch the data from the provider. And if the data is actually, so for example, the user does not have internet data and he turns on the Wi-Fi, then as soon as the connectivity is changed to Wi-Fi or mobile data, we are actually going to call the notifier again. We are calling another set state of map key because Flutter map does not reload again. We are actually changing the keys between this connectivity so that Flutter map also rebuilds. Now let's talk about the functionality. How is everything going on? First of all, in the data layer, we are actually calling the remote API. In this class, the event remote data source class, we are calling the API using the DIO, where we are calling the DIO and getting the response. And this response is in the form of event model, list of event models. Event models are basically the Dart class for the JSON that the API is returning. It has just two things, the name and the time. And we have used JSON serializable package for creating this to JSON and from JSON function. And I used build runner for generating this file so that I don't actually have to write this code. This is pretty small, but if the event model was huge, then this file would have been pretty huge. Then we have another function of toEntity. We'll discuss about it in future, but let me just move forward. So we actually receive the data from the API in the form of list of event models. But now this data we received, this cannot be directly passed into presentation. It actually has to go through domain layer. So the domain layer and the data layer both have a folder called repositories. So what are basically these repositories? So data and domain layer basically share the same kind of repositories where we define the structure of what kind of data we actually expect from the API or from the local data source, and then we actually create an abstract class for that. For example, here I created an abstract class for event repository. I used Dart Z for like getting either thing, either type, so that either it is actually going to throw an exception or it is actually going to return a list of event. But see, here we are returning in the data source, we have checked that we are returning event model, but in the repository we want the event, and these two does not match because event comes from the entities. So what's the difference between models and entities? Basically, model is actually the same to same replica of the APIs, how the API wants data or the how the APIs gives us data. This event in entities actually represent how the presentation layer is going to show the data. So for example, presentation layer just need to show the name, so we'll have just the name here, we won't show the time. So in a complex application we are actually going to have multiple fields where event and event model might be same or might not be the same. That's why we are actually going to convert this event model to event. And how we are doing it? We are doing it in the repository of data. So we created an abstract class here, which is I already explained, which is either going to throw an exception or a list of events. And this we are actually implementing in the repository of data, where we are extending this that event repository from domain layer, and we are actually overriding that function that is either an exception or the list of event. So first of all, if the network is not connected, we are actually going to throw the exception. Else, if network is connected, I also use the retry package to retry the API calls 3 times before throwing an error to the user, so that we, if any kind of issue occurs, we are actually going to retry it again and again only if network is connected. Why I added this retry package? It's basically for some kind of complex situation where the API is throwing 401 error or 403 error. So this retry package, we can actually here we can actually firstly ask for a new token again using the refresh token, and after getting the new access token, we can pass and retry it again. Once we have the data, we are actually mapping the model to event. Now here is the entity function that I talked about, that I'm going to explain in future. It is just basically converting this event model to the event entity. This is the basically this function. And now we either are going to get an exception or we are going to get a list of events. Here, we till this repository, we have the list of exception or the event. Now we are actually going to use it in the notifier. But in the notifier, there could be some kind of complexities. For example, we just want to fetch the upcoming or past lists. And these kind of filters, in this example, we don't have any kind of filter for the API. But for example, if we have filter for the API, and to make the code more maintainable, I also created this use cases class, where this is basically a very basic class that uses this event repository and actually call the events. Why I made this? So that, for example, if we are going to add any filter in the future, we can add the filter here. So the notifier is actually going to call this get use cases class, where getting the data from the events, and then we are also changing the states here. I created a sealed class, this event sealed class, for initial loading, loaded, and error state, that is actually going to change all these states. And then we have a basic state notifier that actually changes based on what the state is and actually notifies the presentation layer. Here you can see that as soon as the fetch function will be called, we are going to change the state to loading, then we are going to fetch the events from the use cases, and we have the result.fold that returns two things again, either an exception or the data. Here we have either the exception or we have the data. Super simple. Now we are actually calling this state notifier in the state notifier provider, so that every the provider can actually use it, and we are registering it. Once registered, we can now use it in a map screen. Again, let me go through the map screen again, where in the init state we were reading this notifier and calling this fetch function. This fetch function is calling the domain layer, this repository is calling this repository implementation, which is calling this dio. So you can see the data structure, the call structure. It's a single way structure. Data and presentation cannot actually talk with each other. They actually have to go through the domain layer for the conversion and for the talking. Now, in the map screen, we are actually fetching this data, initial data, and then we are also calling the data on connectivity change. Another thing that here could be like, whenever we have an error state, yeah, whenever we have an error state, I also added a button for refetching the data here. So this is the whole flow, how the data is going and how is everything. Now let me also talk about if I change the date here. So if I change the date from 14th to basically 13th, and I will go to my application and refresh this, restart. After restarting, you can see now in the upcoming we have two data, because now according to 13th of June we have data, and in the past we have two data. So this is how it is going. Let me also turn off the internet and show it to you. So I turned off the internet, I restarted, and now we don't have any data loading. But as soon as the data is getting as soon as we have the internet, the data will be loaded automatically because of this listener that we added. this lesson. And that's the application. Thank you.